What if a $3 billion art fortune was never fully recorded? And what if one of the most powerful collections in modern history, built under the name of Peggy Guggenheim, was shaped not just by vision, but by timing, war, and a series of transactions no one ever fully documented? In Venice, there is a quiet garden that most visitors never notice because they come for the paintings: Picasso, Pollock, Kandinsky. Names that now carry staggering value, each canvas worth more than entire fortunes once were. Inside the palazzo, the collection feels overwhelming, almost inevitable, as if it had always existed in this form. But step outside into that small garden and you find something else entirely: a simple plaque, a name, a set of dates, no monument, no explanation, just the woman, and a silence that feels strangely deliberate. And that silence is where the questions begin, because the collection inside, now estimated at over $3 billion, did not begin as a fortune at all. It began as something far smaller, tens of thousands of dollars, a number so modest it almost feels like an error when placed beside what it would later become. And that is the first anomaly, because wealth can grow and markets can shift, but transformation at that scale requires more than time. It requires access, it requires opportunity, and sometimes it requires conditions where the normal rules no longer apply. Peggy Guggenheim did not build her collection during stability. She built it during collapse. As Europe moved toward war, as cities emptied and systems fractured, artists who once negotiated prices suddenly found themselves negotiating survival. Studios were abandoned, galleries closed, borders shifted overnight. And in that environment, the value of art did something unusual. It dropped sharply and unpredictably, creating opportunities that only a few could recognize and even fewer could act on. Peggy did. She would later describe her method with a phrase that sounded almost casual: a painting a day. But something about that has never quite made sense. Because collecting is not random, and history is not built on coincidence. To consistently acquire works that would later define modern art, before the world recognized them, suggests something deeper than instinct. It suggests a pattern, a system, or access to information others simply did not have. And that's when things become even stranger, because many of these purchases took place under conditions where documentation barely existed. Artists were moving constantly. Some were fleeing, others were trading their work not for value, but for time, for safety, for passage out of a continent collapsing around them. And in that chaos, ownership became fluid. Records disappeared. Provenance blurred. Entire chains of custody were reduced to memory or lost entirely. What they didn't tell us was that this wasn't just collecting art. It was extracting value from instability, a different kind of extraction, but one that echoed something much older. Because Peggy Guggenheim came from a family that understood extraction better than almost anyone. A dynasty built on silver and copper, on systems designed to pull value from the ground with precision and control. And those systems didn't disappear. They evolved. Instead of mines, there were studios. Instead of ore, there were paintings. Instead of labor, there were artists. Many of them vulnerable, displaced, or desperate enough to sell what they had for far less than it would one day be worth. And Peggy moved through that world with a kind of precision that, in hindsight, feels almost impossible to ignore. Because when historians later tried to reconstruct her collection, what she bought, when she bought it, and how much she paid, they found something unexpected. Gaps, inconsistencies, works that appeared without clear origin, others that were mentioned early, then never seen again. And as decades passed and the value of those works began to rise, the numbers stopped aligning with the records. A collection built for tens of thousands, now worth billions. But the math only works if everything is accounted for. So what happens if it isn't? What happens if part of that fortune was never officially recorded? If certain works changed hands without documentation, or were never meant to appear in the record at all? And more importantly, who would ever be able to prove it? Because by the time the world began to understand what Peggy Guggenheim had built, it was already too late to trace it cleanly. The artists had become legends, the works had become priceless, and the story had already been written. A story of taste, of vision, of cultural impact. But stories are often simplified, especially when the truth is more complicated. And Peggy's story, despite everything that has been written about her, begins long before Venice, long before the paintings, long before the fortune that would quietly multiply beyond recognition. It begins with a family that built one of the most powerful industrial empires in history, and a single event that would fracture it in ways no one could have predicted: a ship. A night in the North Atlantic, and a loss that would shape everything that came after. But this story didn't begin in Venice. Long before the paintings, before the quiet palazzo in Venice, and the fortune that would one day be measured in billions, the story of Peggy Guggenheim began inside a family that had already mastered one thing better than almost anyone else in the modern world: how to turn opportunity into power, and power into something that could outlast generations. The Guggenheim family did not begin as collectors or patrons or cultural figures, but as something far more direct, far more tangible, a family that built its fortune by pulling raw value from the earth itself: silver, copper, resources extracted through systems that rewarded control, timing, and the ability to recognize value before anyone else could see it clearly. And that instinct, that quiet calculation, would echo decades later in ways that are difficult to ignore. The origins of that empire trace back to a man who did not begin with power at all, but with limitation. Born into a world where movement was restricted, opportunity was controlled, and survival depended on persistence more than vision. And yet, through a series of decisions that seemed, at the time, almost accidental, he found himself standing at the edge of something much larger than he could have anticipated: a flooded mine in Colorado that others had abandoned, a problem that looked like failure to anyone unwilling to invest further. But to him, it represented something else entirely: a hidden reserve waiting to be unlocked. And that moment, that decision to stay when others walked away, would become the blueprint for everything that followed. Because what emerged from that mine was not just wealth, but a system, a way of thinking that separated extraction from true profit. Understanding that pulling resources from the ground was only the first step, and that real control came from processing, refining, and owning every stage of the chain. And within a generation, the Guggenheims had transformed themselves from small traders into one of the most powerful industrial networks in the world, their reach extending across continents, their influence touching governments, economies, and labor systems that operated far beyond public view. And yet, even at the height of that power, The family was not unified, not stable, but fractured internally by ambition, rivalry, and decisions that would quietly reshape the inheritance of the next generation. And that is where the story narrows, where the vast machinery of industry gives way to something more personal, more fragile. Because Peggy Guggenheim was not born into the strongest branch of that empire. She was born into one that stood slightly outside of it, close enough to carry the name, but not close enough to inherit its full protection. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Her father, unlike his brothers, did not fully align with the structure that had made the family powerful. He drifted, moved between ventures, distanced himself from the core of the operation, and in doing so, he placed himself and his family on unstable ground, a position that would become painfully clear in a single moment that would define Peggy's life long before she understood its meaning. In April of 1912, he boarded the RMS Titanic, a ship that was meant to represent certainty, engineering, control over risk itself. A vessel designed to move through the Atlantic with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. And for a few days, everything appeared as it should. A routine crossing, a predictable journey, until it wasn't. When the collision came, it did not announce itself as catastrophe, not immediately, not in a way that forced panic, but in subtle shifts, small realizations, calculations that began to emerge as passengers understood what was happening beneath the surface, and for the men aboard, the outcome was quickly understood. There would not be enough lifeboats. There would not be a way out for everyone. What happened next would become part of the official story, repeated so often it hardened into something almost symbolic. A man dressing in formal evening wear, choosing composure over panic, choosing dignity over survival. But what that story leaves out is what it created in its aftermath. Because when the ship disappeared beneath the water, it did not just take a life. It took a position within the family structure. It removed a connection to the larger system of wealth and protection that the Guggenheims had built so carefully. And what remained was something far less secure than the name suggested. Peggy was just a child when her father died, old enough to understand absence, but not old enough to understand its consequences, and those consequences unfolded slowly, quietly, in ways that were easy to overlook from the outside. The inheritance that followed was not insignificant by ordinary standards, but within the context of the Guggenheim family, it was something else entirely, a fraction, a reduced share that placed her on the edge of a world she could see but never fully access. And that gap, that distance between belonging and exclusion, shaped something deeper than circumstance. It created a kind of detachment, a sense of existing inside a system without being protected by it. And that detachment would follow her into adulthood. Because while her cousins moved within structured expectations, business, stability, continuity, Peggy moved differently. Not guided by the same pressures, not bound to the same roles, and that difference would later become the foundation of her decisions. But at the time, it simply looked like uncertainty. A young woman without a defined place, inside one of the most powerful families in America, carrying a name that opened doors but did not provide direction. And yet something else was forming beneath that uncertainty. Because loss, when repeated, does not simply disappear. It accumulates. It reshapes perception. It alters what feels important and what does not. And in Peggy's case, It created a quiet shift away from the values that had defined her family for generations, away from extraction, from industry, from systems built on control, and towards something less tangible, something that could not be measured in the same way, something that did not behave like copper or silver or anything that could be pulled from the ground. But something didn't add up, because the instincts she would later display, the precision with which she moved through the art world, the ability to recognize value before it was visible, felt strangely familiar, almost as if the system she had stepped away from had not disappeared at all, but had simply changed form. And that raises a question that becomes difficult to ignore. The further you follow her story, did Peggy Guggenheim reject the world she was born into, or did she learn from it in ways no one fully understood? Because by the time she left America and entered the cultural circles of Europe, she was no longer just a woman searching for direction. She was carrying something far more subtle, a way of seeing value before it revealed itself. And that is where everything begins to shift. By the time Peggy Guggenheim arrived in Europe, she was not stepping into a world that welcomed her with certainty or structure, but into one that operated on instinct, reputation, and invisible hierarchies that could not be inherited, only navigated. Paris in the early 1920s was not simply a city. It was a shifting ecosystem of writers, painters, and thinkers, a place where identity could be remade but never fully controlled, and for someone like Peggy, who existed between privilege and detachment, it offered something her family never had: ambiguity. She was no longer just a Guggenheim, not entirely, but not free of it either, and that tension became the quiet force shaping everything she did. At first, her presence in this world seemed almost accidental. She moved through cafes and studios, meeting artists who were still unknown, forming connections that at the time carried little measurable value. There was no clear plan, no defined direction, just proximity to creativity and a growing sense that this was where something real was happening. But proximity alone does not explain what came next, because while others were simply participating in this environment, Peggy was absorbing it, studying it in a way that suggests something more deliberate beneath the surface. She formed relationships that blurred the line between personal and strategic. Writers, painters, intellectuals, they were not just companions, they were access points into a system that most outsiders struggled to understand. And slowly, without announcing it, she began to shift from observer to participant, from someone orbiting the art world to someone influencing it in ways that would only become visible much later. But something didn't add up, because Peggy Guggenheim was not trained as a curator. She had no formal expertise, no established reputation, no institutional backing that would justify the level of influence she would eventually achieve. And yet, when you trace the trajectory of her decisions, a pattern begins to emerge, one that feels less like experimentation and more like selection. She began opening spaces, first small, then more defined, creating environments where certain artists were given visibility while others were not. And those choices, subtle at first, began to have consequences. Artists who passed through her orbit gained recognition faster than others. Works that might have remained obscure suddenly became part of conversations that extended beyond the small circles of Paris and London. It looked like support, but it functioned like curation, and that distinction matters, because curation is not passive. It shapes perception. It defines what is seen, what is valued, and ultimately what is remembered. And Peggy, whether intentionally or not, was beginning to influence that process. Then came a turning point. One that at the time may have seemed like nothing more than a conversation, but in hindsight carries a different weight. She met a writer who would later become one of the most influential literary figures of the century, a man who understood something about modern art that few others articulated clearly. He told her to stop looking backward, to stop focusing on established names, and instead to engage with what was still forming, what had not yet been recognized, what existed in the uncertain space between obscurity and importance. And she listened. That decision changed everything, because instead of following the safe path, collecting what was already validated, Peggy turned toward the unknown. She began focusing on contemporary artists, individuals whose work had not yet been absorbed into the mainstream, whose value was still unstable, undefined, and therefore negotiable. And that is where the pattern sharpens. Because recognizing value before it becomes visible is one thing, acting on it consistently is another. And Peggy did not just make one or two successful choices. She made them repeatedly, across different movements, different styles, different individuals who would later define entire eras of modern art. How? That question lingers, because even within the art world, where taste and instinct are often celebrated, this level of precision is rare. It suggests not just intuition, but a framework, a way of filtering information, identifying signals others overlooked, and acting on them before the opportunity disappeared. And that's when things become even more interesting. Because as her confidence grew, so did her ambition. A gallery was no longer enough. It was too small, too limited in scope. What she envisioned required something larger, a space that would not just display art, but define it. A museum, not of the past, but of the present. A place where the future of art could be assembled before anyone else realized what it would become. It was an audacious idea, and it arrived at the worst possible time. Europe was moving toward war. Political tension was no longer abstract. Borders were tightening. Uncertainty was spreading through the same networks Peggy had spent years navigating. And yet, instead of retreating, she accelerated. She made a decision that would later define her legacy. She would build her collection now, not later, when the world stabilized, not when prices returned to normal, but in the middle of collapse, when value was unstable, when access was uneven, and when most people were trying to preserve what they already had. She chose to acquire, systematically, aggressively, and with a level of focus that suggests she understood something others did not. Because while the world saw crisis, she saw opportunity. And that is the moment where the line between collector and strategist begins to blur. Because what followed was not random. It was not chaotic. It was structured. She moved through studios, through networks of artists and dealers, through spaces where decisions had to be made quickly, often without documentation, often without the safeguards that normally define ownership. And piece by piece, she began assembling what would later become one of the most important collections of modern art in history. But even at this stage, before the war had fully taken hold, before the collection had reached the scale we recognize today, there were already signs that something larger was unfolding. Because Peggy Guggenheim was no longer just participating in the art world. She was shaping it, quietly, precisely, and in ways that would only become fully visible once it was too late to reverse. The rise had begun, but what it was building toward was something far more complicated than success. By the time the war tightened its grip on Europe, the system Peggy Guggenheim had been building quietly beneath the surface began to reveal its first visible cracks, not in the sense of failure, but in the sense of contradiction, because what appeared on the outside as a remarkable act of cultural preservation began, on closer inspection, to look far more complex, shaped by forces that were rarely acknowledged and decisions that were almost never fully documented. As German forces advanced and cities fell one by one, the art world did not simply pause, it fractured, and within that fracture, value shifted again, not just in price, but in meaning, because paintings were no longer objects of admiration alone. They became currency, leverage, a means of survival in a system where the rules were dissolving faster than anyone could track. Peggy moved through that environment with a calm that others later described as unusual, even unsettling, continuing to acquire works while artists were preparing to flee, while collectors were trying to hide what they owned, while institutions that once defined legitimacy refused to act. At one point, she approached a major museum for help, storing her growing collection, and was turned away. The works considered unimportant, not worth the space. A decision that in hindsight feels almost incomprehensible, but at the time reflected something else entirely. A failure to recognize what was unfolding, or perhaps a reluctance to engage with it. But something didn't add up. Because while official institutions hesitated, Peggy did not, and that difference created a kind of imbalance, a space where she could operate without the constraints that normally governed acquisition, ownership, and preservation. She arranged for her collection to be moved quietly, stored temporarily in locations that were not designed for such responsibility, transferred again as conditions changed, each movement creating another layer of uncertainty, another break in the chain of documentation that historians would later struggle to reconstruct. And this is where the story becomes difficult to follow cleanly, because in times of war, clarity is a luxury, and the movement of art across borders, especially art that is not yet considered valuable, rarely leaves behind a complete record. Crates were labeled vaguely. Ownership was assumed rather than verified. Transactions were made quickly, often without witnesses, often without the kind of documentation that would survive beyond the moment itself. And within that environment, the distinction between preservation and acquisition becomes harder to define. What they didn't tell us was how easily those lines could blur. Because while Peggy was saving art, she was also consolidating it, bringing together works from different places, different artists, different contexts, into a single collection that would later be understood as intentional, as curated, as if it had always been assembled with a clear vision in mind. But at the time, the process was anything but orderly. It was reactive, adaptive, shaped by urgency rather than design. And that raises a question that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. How much of what she collected was chosen, and how much simply became available under the right conditions? Because availability in a collapsing system is not neutral. It is shaped by pressure, by fear, by decisions made under constraints that distort value and limit options. Artists who might have held on to their work under normal circumstances let it go. Dealers who might have negotiated differently accepted whatever was offered. And Peggy, moving through that shifting landscape, was in a position to act when others could not. That is not a criticism, but it is not a coincidence either. And that's when things become even more complicated. Because as her collection grew, so did the number of people connected to it: artists, assistants, intermediaries, individuals who facilitated transactions. arranged transport, secured documents, each one adding another layer to a system that was already difficult to track. Among them were figures whose roles were never fully defined in public accounts, individuals who helped move people and objects out of dangerous regions, who operated in the gray spaces between legality and necessity, where survival depended on speed and discretion. And in those gray spaces, records tend to disappear or never exist at all. By the time Peggy managed to leave Europe, carrying with her not just a collection, but an entire network of relationships, the structure she had built was already far more complex than it appeared. The works were packed, declared in ways that minimized attention, transported across borders at a moment when movement itself was heavily restricted, and when they finally arrived, intact, in a different country, the story that followed was remarkably simple. A collector had saved art from war. But simplicity can be misleading, because what arrived was not just a group of paintings. It was a concentration of value that had been assembled under conditions no longer accessible, a collection shaped by timing that could not be repeated, by opportunities that existed only within that narrow window of collapse. And once those conditions disappeared, the ability to reconstruct how that collection came together disappeared with them. And that is where the cracks begin to widen. Because when the collection was later exhibited, when it began to receive recognition, when critics and institutions started to understand its significance, they were responding to what they could see, not to how it had been formed. The narrative focused on preservation, on vision, on cultural importance, and those elements were real. But they were not complete. Something was missing, not visibly, not in a way that disrupted the story outright, but in the details, in the gaps, in the absence of a clear, continuous record that could explain every transition, every acquisition, every movement from one place to another. And in those gaps, questions remain. Because collections of this scale, this importance, are usually built through systems that leave traces, contracts, archives, institutional oversight. Peggy Guggenheim's collection, by contrast, emerged from a moment where those systems had broken down. And while that made it possible, it also made it difficult to verify. Which brings us to an uncomfortable possibility. That part of what she built exists beyond full documentation, not lost, not hidden in the conventional sense, but never entirely recorded to begin with. And if that is true, then the collection we see today, the one valued in the billions, may not be the complete story. It may only be the visible portion of something much larger. And that realization changes how we understand everything that follows, because the cracks in the story are not signs of failure. They are signs of something unfinished. The turning point did not arrive with a single dramatic event, not in the way history often prefers to frame it, but as a convergence, a moment where everything Peggy Guggenheim had been building, quietly, precisely, and under conditions few could fully understand, suddenly became visible, not just as a collection, but as a force. By the time she reached New York in the early 1940s, carrying with her the works she had gathered across a collapsing Europe, the world she entered was not prepared for what she had assembled, because what arrived was not simply art, it was a concentration of potential, a shift waiting to happen. At first, it did not look that way. The paintings were unfamiliar, disruptive, difficult to place within the structures American audiences were accustomed to. European modernism had not yet fully translated across the Atlantic, and the works Peggy brought with her existed in a kind of cultural limbo, too advanced for immediate acceptance, too unconventional to be easily understood. But Peggy did not wait for understanding. She created it. And that was the moment where her role changed. Because opening a gallery was not a passive act. It was a declaration, a decision to place certain works in front of the public, to define what deserved attention, what deserved legitimacy, and what could be ignored. And the space she created was unlike anything that had existed before. Not static, not neutral, but immersive, designed to control how art was experienced, how it was perceived, and ultimately, how it would be remembered. But something didn't add up. Because Peggy was not simply introducing European art to America, she was doing something more subtle, more consequential. She was placing it alongside emerging American artists, individuals who had not yet been defined, whose work existed outside any established framework, and by doing so, she created a bridge between two worlds that had previously operated separately. That bridge changed everything, because once those worlds intersected, something new began to form, a movement that would later be called abstract expressionism, a shift that redefined the center of the art world, moving it away from Europe and toward the United States. And at the center of that shift, not visibly, not officially, but undeniably, was Peggy Guggenheim. She identified artists others dismissed. She supported work others did not understand. And she did it with a consistency that feels, in retrospect, almost calculated. Take one example. A painter whose work was considered chaotic, unstructured, difficult to interpret. Most collectors saw risk. Peggy saw something else. She provided him with financial support, gave him space to work, and most importantly, gave him visibility. That painter was Jackson Pollock, and the decision to support him would later be understood as one of the most important moments in modern art. But at the time it looked uncertain, unproven, and that is what makes the pattern so difficult to ignore. Because Peggy did not just support one artist, she supported several, repeatedly, across different styles, different approaches, different individuals who would later become central figures in a movement that reshaped the global art landscape. And that raises a question that becomes impossible to avoid. Was this intuition or something more structured? Because shaping a movement is not the same as participating in one. It requires timing. It requires selection. It requires an understanding of how influence spreads, how recognition forms, how value is assigned not just through creation, but through exposure. And Peggy understood exposure. Her gallery was not just a space, it was a system. A place where certain artists were elevated, where certain works were framed as important before the world had decided they were, and in doing so, she accelerated a process that might otherwise have taken decades. And that acceleration created something powerful, but also something fragile, because movements once defined attract attention, and attention brings scrutiny, and scrutiny begins to reveal what was previously overlooked. Financial questions began to surface, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, within circles that understood the scale of what had been assembled. How had this collection, built under such unstable conditions, transitioned so seamlessly into a position of influence? How had works acquired for relatively small sums begun to define entire movements worth millions? And more importantly, what was the true extent of what she controlled? Because by this point, Peggy Guggenheim was no longer just a collector. She was a gatekeeper, a figure whose decisions influenced not only what art was seen, but what art would matter. And that kind of influence rarely exists without consequence. Her personal life, already complicated, began to reflect that pressure. Relationships strained under the weight of imbalance, of dependency, of roles that were never clearly defined. Artists who benefited from her support also resisted it. They needed her, but they did not want to be defined by her. And that tension created fractures that extended beyond the personal into the very structure of the world she was helping to shape. But the most significant shift was not emotional. It was structural, because as her influence grew, so did the gap between what was visible and what remained unseen. The collection she exhibited was only part of the story. The works that had been moved, stored, transferred under uncertain conditions, those remained largely outside public understanding, existing in a kind of parallel narrative that was never fully integrated into the official record. And that is where the turning point reveals itself most clearly, because by the time Peggy decided to leave New York, to close the gallery, to move once again, this time to Venice, the system she had built had reached a kind of completion, not an ending, but a transition. The collection was no longer forming, it was stabilizing, becoming fixed, defined. And once something is defined, it becomes easier to preserve, but harder to question. The works were no longer just acquisitions, they were history. And history, once established, resists revision. Which means that whatever inconsistencies existed, whatever gaps had formed during the years of acquisition, whatever details had been lost or never recorded, they were now embedded within a narrative that would be repeated, reinforced, and eventually accepted. A story of vision, of timing, of cultural transformation, all of it true, but not necessarily complete. Because as Peggy Guggenheim moved into the final phase of her life, carrying with her the collection that would define her legacy, one question remained unresolved, lingering beneath everything that had been built. Not what she created, but how much of it was ever fully known, and that question would not disappear. In the end, the story of Peggy Guggenheim does not close with a revelation, but with a transition so quiet it is easy to miss. A movement from influence to legacy, from control to preservation, and from a system built in motion to one that appears, on the surface, complete. When she settled in Venice, in the unfinished palazzo on the Grand Canal, the urgency that had defined her earlier years seemed to dissolve, replaced by routine, by structure, by a life that revolved around the collection she had already assembled. Visitors came and went. The paintings remained. And over time, the narrative began to stabilize. But stability can be misleading, because what appears complete is not always fully understood, and what appears documented is not always fully recorded. By the time Peggy opened her home to the public, allowing people to walk through rooms where masterpieces hung casually on the walls, the collection had already passed through too many transitions, too many conditions where clarity was not a priority, where survival, movement, and timing mattered more than documentation. And once those moments had passed, they could not be reconstructed cleanly. What they saw was the result, not the process. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because the process is where the anomalies live. Even as the collection gained recognition, even as it was exhibited, studied, and eventually absorbed into the institutional framework of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, there remained questions that were never fully resolved, not publicly, not definitively, but quietly, within the spaces between records. Works whose origins were incomplete. Transactions that could not be traced in full. Movements across borders that left behind fragments rather than documentation. And yet, none of that disrupted the narrative, because by then, the narrative had become too powerful. A woman who had saved art from war. A collector who had recognized genius before the world did. A figure who had helped shape modern art itself. All of it true. But truth, when simplified, can obscure as much as it reveals. Because what remains difficult to measure is not the value of the collection that has been calculated, recalculated, adjusted over time until it reached into the billions, but the structure that made it possible, the conditions that allowed such a concentration of value to form in the first place, and whether those conditions also allowed elements of that value to exist outside the boundaries of what was formally recorded. But something didn't add up. Because collections of this scale, built under normal circumstances, leave behind extensive trails, contracts, archives, institutional oversight, systems designed to ensure that every piece can be traced, verified, accounted for. Peggy Guggenheim's collection, by contrast, emerged from a moment where those systems had fractured, where oversight was inconsistent, where the urgency of movement replaced the need for documentation. And that creates a possibility that is difficult to ignore. That part of what she built may never have entered the record at all. Not because it was hidden deliberately, not necessarily, but because the conditions in which it was acquired did not require it to be recorded in the way we would expect today. Pieces may have changed hands informally. Others may have been moved, stored, or even exchanged without leaving behind the kind of documentation that would survive decades later. And if that is true, then the collection we see now, the one preserved, exhibited, and valued, may not represent the full extent of what once existed. It may only represent what could be stabilized, what could be integrated into a narrative that made sense, what could be preserved within the systems that came later. Because once Peggy transferred her collection to the foundation, once it became part of an institution, the nature of the story changed. Institutions require clarity. They require structure. They require records that can be verified and repeated. And so the collection, like many things that pass from private control into public preservation, was shaped into something more defined, more consistent, more stable. But in that process, something else may have been lost, not physically, but historically. Because the ambiguity that existed at the beginning, the uncertainty, the gaps, the inconsistencies, those do not disappear. They are simply absorbed into a larger narrative, one that prioritizes coherence over complexity. And that leaves us with a question that does not have a clear answer. Not how much Peggy Guggenheim achieved. That is visible. But how much of what she built was ever fully understood? Because when we walk through the palazzo today, when we see the paintings arranged with quiet confidence, when we read the names that now define entire movements, we are looking at the result of a process that unfolded under conditions that cannot be recreated, cannot be fully traced, and perhaps cannot be fully explained. And in that sense, the collection is not just a reflection of art history. It is a fragment of something larger, a system that existed for a brief moment in time where value could be recognized before it was defined, where opportunity could be acted upon before it was regulated, and where the boundaries between preservation and acquisition were not always clear. That moment has passed. The systems have stabilized. The records are now maintained. But the questions remain. And they remain because they are built into the foundation of the story itself, a collection worth billions, a process that cannot be fully reconstructed, and a legacy that feels complete, but never entirely closed. Because sometimes the most important part of a story is not what is visible, but what was never fully recorded.